As far as I know, the arguments for God I elaborate here, plus 6 other analogously argued ones, are the only valid and unassailably premised deductive arguments for the existence of God to date. The most important thing to remember about these arguments are that they depend on the criteria of truth and morality in the 2 logically self-refuting deductive arguments for atheism that I will elaborate. So there are 8 deductive arguments for God, only 2 of which are developed here. The other 6 analogously involve the ultimate criteria of purpose, intelligibility, meaning, communication, mind, and personhood. If there are more, they too will depend on the ultimate background criteria of general rationality. There simply is nothing more logically basic than the ultimate meta-theoretic assumptions of the system of inquiry that is necessary to approach any issue, including the issue of God's existence. Both arguments elaborated here are based on prior criteria that is already being used generally in conducting the analysis of anything. You can't escape the need for an ultimate standard without that attempted escape itself, assuming that same standard's ultimacy in that escape process. Any argument for denying that standard necessarily uses that same ultimate rational standard of thought in order to try to infer its own conclusion on the issue. And the mind relations involved between that adjudicating system and one's own mind are ultimate and indistinguishable from a finite mind's necessary relations to an ultimate personal God. This cannot be denied without both assuming it and operating according to it in the process of communicating that denial. So reason has ultimate, universal, comprehensive, belief-deciding authority, the final court of appeal for all possible truth claims. But those characteristics make reason indistinguishable from God. Any attempt to deny or circumvent the ultimate authority of reason is self-contradictory. All anti-rationalist views, in spite of their differences, rely on the same principles they are trying to undermine. The voice of reason is silently literal and indicates its personhood as logos. The meta-theoretic breakdown of atheism began in 1929, when Wilbur Marshall Urban realized that naturalism's own universal claims and assumptions, along with its reduction of all reality to specific causal factors, deductively refute naturalism itself. Both determinism and naturalism render themselves and belief in them to also be merely accidental, causally eventuated effects of evolving matter, products of the universally determining factors they specify, and nothing more. Consequently, what naturalism says about itself implies its own incoherence and meaninglessness, because it, too, is, according to its own assertion, merely causally eventuated by naturalistic factors and nothing more. And even that fact itself cannot be known for the same reason. Consequently, so-called truth is rendered a myth by naturalism, completely insignificant compared to sheer physical causation, the exclusive, comprehensive determiner that naturalism specifies in order to be the theory that it is. But even though naturalism was thereby exposed as self-destroying with deductive logical finality, within 3 decades, philosophical atheism produced, completely aside from naturalism, 3 pivotal deductive arguments for atheism, discovered and elaborated by British philosopher Anthony Flew from the 1940s through the 1980s. His landmark book, God and Philosophy, was published in 1966, with a new introduction added in the 1986 edition, which was titled God, A Critical Inquiry. Those three arguments, although immensely influential for decades, are based on self-referential fallacies. Flew's first deductive argument for atheism, the unfalsifiability argument, or the invisible gardener argument, was that since there is no way to verify or falsify belief in God, it is consequently incoherent and therefore meaningless. God is claimed to be an invisible gardener who eludes all attempts at detection and is therefore indistinguishable from something just imagined or made up or nothing at all. But the fallacy of that argument is that it already itself uses unverifiable and unfalsifiable general rationality itself, which includes both formal and applied logic, as an ultimate God of mind. It even defines mind itself in its own necessary operational assumptions. Flew's second deductive argument for atheism, Stratonicianism, or the Stratonician argument, reasoned that it's impossible for there to be an overarching explanation of the universe itself or the total reality, because the criterion of explanatory adequacy within the world is the only meaningful model of explanation we have or can possibly have. In other words, intra-world explanations, explanations of things within our world, are all we have to go on and all we use, and are the only possible basis of any explanation of anything, including the total reality itself. An overall explanation is no explanation at all because it makes no sense in relation to our possible experience of explanation. The problem with this argument is that the criterion of explanatory adequacy itself functions as an ultimate overarching explanation of the total reality, not itself a mere intra-world explanation that the argument claims that all explanations are reducible to, which is self-contradictory in being self-referentially inconsistent. It includes itself in what it refers to, and yet it contradicts that fact. In fact, if the only possible explanations were intra-world explanations, you couldn't know that fact itself. This self-reference error is common to almost 24 major philosophies throughout human history. See the lingering questions section in the article that I refer to in the description. Flew's third deductive argument for atheism, called the presumption argument, argued for the logically prior necessity of procedurally assuming atheism by default in analyzing anything, since God is not a requirement for any argument to either be begun or validly reasoned. Consistent with the biblical notion of humanity's separation from God, this is a valid argument until you realize what it both assumes and implies. The fatal error of this argument is that it uses general reason or rationality itself not only as a God of mind, but as God of this issue itself, which pertains universally to what is or is not a rationally necessary prior assumption about the ultimate governance of analysis itself, regardless of the subject matter. These three arguments had a devastating effect on belief in God among intellectual influencers in the Western world in the decades that followed, assisted by the emergence of various relativistic perspectives such as pragmatism, subjectivism, social constructivism, conventionalism, naturalized epistemology, and postmodernist perspectives generally. So by the beginning of the 1970s, Anthony Flew was far and away the most influential atheistic thinker in history. In 1971, Anthony Flew's finest student, American-Canadian philosopher Kai Nielsen, in his book Ethics Without God, stated the following simple but unprecedented observation. In any possible argument for God's goodness, we're already assuming an ultimate criterion for anything to be considered good, even in order to begin analyzing the issue. The goal of analysis is to find an argument that has valid reasoning and true assumptions, which is a universal good of all thought, even in thinking about morality itself. However, a non-moral good cannot decide what a moral good is, which means that logical validity is a required, already existing universal and ultimate good, the only standard for knowing what is good in any sense and in any realm, whether in theory or in ordinary everyday moral and ethical aspects of life. In my opinion, this criterion point makes Kai Nielsen the greatest thinker of all time. Let me repeat that. In my opinion, this prior criterion point makes Kai Nielsen the greatest thinker of all time, which means that he is the greatest atheistic thinker of all time as well, replacing Flew at that point. Yet the argument saved belief in God by accident, while Nielsen himself thought he was refuting belief in God, because his prior criterion observation inadvertently led to the 2012 arguments, the 2012 discovery of the following two ultra-deductive arguments for the existence of God. These arguments are based on the entire comprehensive system of deductive argumentation rules, formal logic, and general empirically informed rationality. The basic operational concepts and rules for functioning as a mind prove God's existence to the point where any opposition to this conclusion itself assumes all the same God-level and God-like characteristics about general rationality itself in that same process of trying to argue against it. Reason itself has qualities that are indistinguishable from the qualities of God. Whether you are an atheist or a believer, you are ultimately relying on the authority of reason, which functions as God of mind. That is not to say that atheists and agnostics secretly believe in God, but they still treat reason as inherently God-like, an ideal, morally obligating system of mind that tests for truth and decides belief. So this reflective metatheoretic moral criterion argument reveals an ultimate level of moral goodness that must already be assumed in any analysis, including moral analysis. And that is the same system of inquiry that you are assuming at this very moment as you analyze what I am saying. Consequently, traditional arguments cannot possibly prove God's goodness, nor can any other possible argument, because all possible arguments for the goodness of God must already assume that it is an obligating, ultimate moral good to always try to think in an empirically informed, rational way in general, whether about God or anything else. And that must be done in order to survive, in order to reflect, and in order to thrive in a commonly real world. But a prior moral ideal that we must already always assume in the general system-wide standards of analysis itself is a timelessly necessary intuition on pain of self-referential contradiction to prefer one thing, anything, over anything else. It is the ideal good by which all things must be morally and ethically evaluated. The moral, ethical ideal is indistinguishable from a morally good, ultimate, and perfect mind, or logos, or God.